Good afternoon and welcome to today's Made by McGill Alumni webcast. Why does everything cost so much? My name is Desautels, Managing Director of Communications at McGill's Office of University Advancement, and it's Tuesday, February 21st, 2023. All it takes these days is a single visit to a grocery store, a gas station, or a travel website to come face to face with the full brunt of inflation. And that's assuming you can even find the product you're looking for. Grocery and clothing stores are having a difficult time keeping their shelves fully stocked. Car dealerships are running out of vehicles, and stories abound of parents scrambling between pharmacies to find cough syrup for their children. This is not what the roaring 20s were supposed to be like. Kidding aside, this economic upheaval is causing serious strain for many, especially families struggling to feed and clothe their households, and seniors living on fixed incomes. Canada's food price report says the price of groceries is up more than 10% from a year ago, which translates into a cost increase of over $1,000 a year for a family of four. No surprise, visits to food banks are up more than 35% from pre-pandemic levels, and all forecasts point to costs rising even higher in 2023. What is driving inflation to levels we haven't seen in decades? Why can't manufacturers, shippers, and retailers get goods out to market quickly? And what can we as consumers do to cope with this economic shock? Joining me today are two McGill professors who spend their working days trying to make sense of pricing models, supply chain breakdowns, and the impact this is having on all of us. Let me introduce them. Javad Nasiry is a professor of operations management at the Desautels Faculty of Management and director of McGill's Sustainable Growth Initiative, a cross-disciplinary academic center established to help businesses transition to a socially and environmentally sustainable model. Welcome, Professor Nasiry.
Thanks for having me.
Pascal Thériault is an agricultural economist, senior faculty lecturer, and director of the Farm Management and Technology Program at McGill's Faculty of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences on our beautiful McDonald campus. Thank you, Professor Thériault, as well, for joining today for this really important discussion. Now, before we get started, note that if you're watching us live and have a question for either of our panelists, you can send them to us by email at aoc@mcgill.ca, and we'll do our best to address them to our guests. So let's get started. Professor Thériault, perhaps I'll begin with you. From a pricing perspective, how dire is the situation in our grocery stores right now? And what is causing economists such as yourself the most alarm?
Well, we are right now seeing price levels that we have not seen in the last 40 years. And quite often when we look at food prices, we can usually identify one factor in particular that's causing that spike in prices. Right now, it's coming from everywhere at the same time. We know that the food price index have surpassed the consumer price index, general consumer price index. And that's not something that we've seen in the past, that we're used to see in the past.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so again, I think we'll have a chance to get into a little bit of some of the reasons why this is happening. Let me bring in Professor Nasiry. I know your expertise is more in sort of supply chain management and supply chain issues. So my basic understanding of the economy suggests that pricing is often dictated by supply and demand, and the less supply we have, the higher prices will rise. So as someone who studies supply chains for a living, can you paint a picture for us of the current state of global supply chains and how this might be impacting the ability of retailers to keep their shelves stocked and their prices at what we consider a reasonable level?
Absolutely, a very good question, Derek. So I would say we have three factors at the moment that are affecting global supply chains. One is the unfortunate war in Ukraine, and that is affecting quite a bit the supply of agricultural products, including fertilizers that is used in other parts of the world to grow agricultural products. The second one is the decoupling of supply chains, especially between East and West, which is mainly due to political reasons. I would be happy to elaborate on that later on. And the third one is the COVID pandemic that still has its lingering effects on supply chains. And these together are affecting retailers and what it is that they can offer for their customers to buy.
So it sounds like it's a very complex issue right now that's really, we're getting hit by a bunch of different areas. I will definitely come back to you because I do want to explore some of those points a bit more and really try to help me and our viewers understand a bit maybe what some of the solutions might be. Let me just bring Professor Thériault back in at this point, though. We were talking briefly about food prices. How much of an impact is supply chain issues impacting food prices? I guess the basic question I would ask is, are we growing less food than ever before? Or is there also more complex things at play here that are impacting our grocery bills?
Oh, it's much more complex than just growing less food. Of course, 2021 was a bad crop year, so we had less crops available. But for the most part, we're not growing less food or producing less food for that matter. But as my colleague mentioned, input prices went up for farmers, energy prices went up, wages went up, therefore crop prices went up. And that's not even considering the fact that there's a war going on that's affecting also supply. So the processors had to pay more for their agricultural crops and then pay more to package it, pay more to transport it, pay more for their own labor themselves. And so that was linked all the way to the consumer. So processors had choices to make at some point, and in many cases, those choices were to just cut back on some of the products they were offering. And we've seen lots of products that we can't find anymore because for some processors, instead of having 15 different varieties of a product, they're down to 10 or to 8 just to try to minimize that those inefficiencies you have in the supply chain right now.
Interesting. So let me go back to a couple of the issues that both of you touched on. Let's start with the war in Ukraine. In fact, this week we're going to be celebrating the grim one-year anniversary of the war, and based on news and events coming out of Europe and Moscow this morning, it looks like there is no end in sight to this war anytime soon. So I'd like to maybe revisit that, Professor Thériault. I know when the war first broke out, there was a lot of concern in parts of Africa in particular and other, I guess, developing parts of the world that relied on the Ukraine for, food supplies directly. And there was concerns about famine. But what you're saying or suggesting is that there's actually a ripple effect that's impacting all of us who eat food around the world. Can you explain a little bit more about how some of the sort of, I guess, delays or concerns in Ukraine are rippling out around the world?
Well, it's a big game of global supply and demand. So if we were expecting a given quantity of wheat, for example, coming out of Ukraine, and that quantity of wheat is not there, it has to come from somewhere else. So given a fixed demand, if the supply is not there, that will drive up the prices. And in economies where the food basket's even more important for families, that can have some very bad effects. That and the fact that because of the war, we had a harder time acquiring some fertilizers, for example. We know that Eastern North America depended on Russian fertilizer to fertilize our fields. So with the duties that were imposed on everything coming out of Russia, that increased the price of fertilizers, that even increased the price of wheat, for example, even more.
So I went to the store this weekend and I bought a loaf of bread. I don't think my wife knows this yet, but I paid, I think, $4.99 for a loaf of palm bread. I don't think I've ever paid that much in my life. So I guess that's really part and parcel of what we're talking about, all of the impacts happening on the other side of the world.
And sometime, if you take containers, for example, we had a major problem with containers. Price of containers went up. When the price of containers go up today, we live the effects of those high container prices for 12 to 18 months after the fact. So it's not because they were high in the past that we're not paying for it now.
Okay. So Professor Nasiry, I see you nodding along vigorously to a lot of what Professor Thériault has been saying. You also mentioned in your comments the price of oil being the one of the factors that you touched on. Can you talk a little bit? I mean, I know we're all, obviously, those of us who drive, see the price of oil, the price of gas at the gas stations. But I guess this is, again, having a much bigger impact in ways that we're not necessarily thinking about every time we shop, correct?
Absolutely. So the price of oil is not only impacting the cost of fuel, the gas that we are putting in our cars, but it is also affecting many other supply chains because many parts of the economy directly or indirectly depend on oil. In case the price of oil goes up, then the price of the ingredients that goes into the production of agricultural product or other products for that matter also goes up. And when the cost goes up, then the manufacturers are going to transfer these increased costs to customers in the form of higher prices or in some cases, broken assortments. that we cannot find anymore because manufacturers are trying to optimize their operations, and sometimes they will decide to discontinue certain products in order to focus on what's more important to their business.
Okay. Now, the other thing you mentioned, Professor Nasiry, when you were outlining the sort of factors, you made a reference to sort of East-West, sort of divisions between East and West. So I want to come back on that. And it's interesting because just this morning, I was listening to a New York Times podcast that was talking about how dozens of multinational companies, including a lot of actually Chinese-based, Chinese-owned manufacturers, are starting to set up factories elsewhere. And in particular, in this case, they were talking about Mexico in an effort to move production closer to their main markets, which again, in this case, would be the United States. And it was suggested that manufacturers and retailers were starting to get concerned about concentrating so much of their products in China, in Asia, depending on transoceanic shipping, which is obviously much more expensive now in this environment. And in fact, one example the reporter who was interviewed on the podcast talked about was Walmart, saying that they no longer wanted to do business with suppliers who rely exclusively on China for their products. So I'm wondering if, broadly speaking, if you can talk about what moves like this mean for all of us. Is this good for the reliability of supply chains? And might this have an impact in some way on consumer prices down the road?
So there are two things that one has to consider in what I call the decoupling of supply chains, East and West. And one of them is that this trend is not something recent. We have seen this before the pandemic, and that is only gathering up some pace over time. And the fact that some manufacturing is moving away from China, and some retailers are deciding to produce in other corners of the world, especially closer to home, let's say in Canada or in US or in some countries close to home. The reason is that costs are going up to manufacture in China as well. This has not been a new trend. This has been going on for almost a decade. And if the costs of production are going up in China, it is only logical that the manufacturers or the retailers are going to look for alternatives, either in Asia or other parts, to produce their products. So that's basically an econ rationale behind what we are seeing in global supply chains. And the second issue in here is political. And that one is perhaps a bit more recent. In the past, maybe 5 or 6 years, we are seeing this trend essentially picking up in pace. And that reflects certain worries that countries have about protecting their property rights and trying to make sure that the key supplies to their countries are protected from certain political issues that may come down the road.
Okay, a very diplomatic way to answer that question. But I guess in the past, and I'm thinking now, you also mentioned COVID as one of the sort of things we need to be thinking about as part of this conversation. And I guess in the past, China was just seen as like the most reliable supplier. If you're dealing with China, don't worry, there's a huge population, a huge workforce, the products are going to get here. And of course, a lot of retailers and consumers learned a lot of lessons when China was probably as impacted more than any other country in terms of the lockdowns and government wanting to initially put through a zero COVID policy. So is COVID sort of been a bit of a wake-up call for, retailers like Walmart and companies like Apple and others that it's not a good idea to rely on a single country for exports?
So I would say there are two things to consider in this case as well. First of all, COVID, among the three factors I mentioned, so the war in Ukraine, the decoupling of supply chains, and the COVID, that's the one that is easing off rapidly in comparison to the other two factors, in the sense that China was following very stringent zero COVID policy up until November 2022. And after the protests, the largest scale protests that we had in China, decided to ease the restrictions. And essentially right now there is no restrictions to travel and so on and so forth. Of course, this zero COVID policy was putting a lot of stress on supply chains because China even now is a major manufacturing hub. And in case production facilities or cities can be locked down in a short notice, that is going to have the impact on all supply chains, including food supply chains. And we can see the consequences that we have at the moment. But that's basically easing off. because all the major economies in the supply chain, global supply chains have relaxed these restrictions, and that is going to be easing up. But the second factor in here is that, as you mentioned, COVID was essentially a wake-up call. It was not the first time that we are seeing the importance of safeguarding manufacturing capabilities, but this was a wake-up call that in times of crisis, however rare they may be, countries need to have some capacity in order to cope with these crises. So, for example, the cost of producing one N95 mask is barely 30, 40 cents. But at the height of the pandemic, we were paying $4.5 here in Montreal to buy one N95 mask. And the reason is that Canada did not have the capabilities, the manufacturing capacity to produce them in-house. So, of course, this is quite important. And going forward, countries are trying to be a bit more self-reliant, at least in key strategic issues that matter for the safety and security of their economies.
Wow, this is super interesting. I think we're 15 minutes in. I'm already feeling like I'm starting to understand it. I'm starting to get this. So a question for just a reminder, if anyone who's watching live and wants to send in a question for either of our professors, you can email us at aoc@mcgill.ca. Professor Thériault, I'd like to bring you back in on this particular question, this notion of sort of diversifying our markets and where we get products from. And I'm wondering if we ought to be thinking about this sort of notion of diversification when it comes to food production as well. So unlike N95 masks, I don't suppose we can start, I don't know, growing pineapples and avocados here in Quebec, for instance. But should we be thinking about agricultural strategies that might, for example, offer those of us who live in northern climates a way to become less dependent on a small number of fertile regions for so much of our food?
In theory, the answer is yes, but practically speaking, it's extremely hard to do because we've all enjoyed as consumers, first of all, a cheap basket of food for a very long time and a huge diversity of food products. Going back 3-4 generations ago, our ancestors would spend their winters eating carrots, potatoes, onions, and turnip. I don't think anybody wants to go back to those days. We enjoy our orange juice, we enjoy our mangoes and our pineapple. So cutting ourselves from external markets is extremely hard, and it's not necessarily desired by consumers either. But what we might have to do as consumers is think about adapting better. We know we rely, for example, on California quite a bit for fruits and vegetables. California has their own problems caused by climate change. They have a hard time accessing water. They have a hard time with forest fires also. That has impact over time. So, of course, for example, Quebec has a policy to develop some sort of higher food production to be able to better serve us, but that will not solve all the problems because the whole North American food system is interconnected.
Mm-hmm. So let me just follow up on that question. You mentioned California, and I think I was reading somewhere we get something like 40% of our fruits and vegetables from like one or two valleys in California. We're very dependent on that. And I'm thinking of that question or that problem in the context of climate change. So you mentioned California. Every time we seem to put on the news these days, there's another weather-related event happening that's impacting, you know, the region, whether it's flash flooding, extreme droughts, forest fires. And I can't help, you know, one can't help but wonder whether the source of so much of our fresh produce has become vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So how would you suggest that we sort of deal with that as a, you know, something that's going to be with us for a while now?
We are indeed dependent on California for some of our food products, but our two economies between California and Canada are quite interconnected, and we have to keep in mind that California is just a state, but as far as an economy is concerned, it's a bigger economy than Canada. So in any given year, we import more from California than we export, and it's true that fruits and vegetables do tend to come a lot from California, but we have to keep in mind we live in a quite northern climate. I think this morning was a harsh reminder of that. And so lettuce has to come from somewhere. And it comes from California, it comes from Arizona, it comes from Mexico. And those fresh crops move with season in order to supply not only us, but even New York, for example, or Boston, that do have harsher climate and cannot grow lettuce all year long.
So interesting.
Maybe I can also add a little footnote to what Pascal said. And that's also the attention that we have to the amount of waste, food waste that we have here at home. So annually in Canada, we have about 50 million tons of food waste, out of which 60% is what we call avoidable. So of course, there is a part of this waste that is unavoidable because the byproduct of the production and processing of the food. But then 60% or around 30 million tons every year is in food waste, which is happening all along the supply chains, especially with the distribution, wholesaling, retailing, and of course, final consumers. So that would be an area that we could also think about in order to try and secure a better food supply chain here in Canada.
So that's a very interesting point. Is there anything else you think, Professor Nasiry, we should be doing, given how dependent we are on, geopolitical factors, weather events that take place, out of our control, far away? Is there anything like at the local or national levels that we and our governments should be, putting in place to maybe insulate ourselves from some of these faraway economic impacts?
Absolutely. So from my point of view, and of course Pascal can help me with this one. Besides trying to be a bit more sustainable in how we manage the food supply chains in terms of the amount of waste that is being produced, we can also try and be innovative. So encouraging innovation and entrepreneurship in food supply chains is also important. So, and you might have heard of loofah farms here in Canada and Quebec that are essentially trying to develop what we call urban farming practices. And of course, the success of these urban farms has to be seen over time. They're mainly experimental at the moment, and they are not really making a dent in the amount of demand that we have for food, but it is something definitely worthwhile to think about and hopefully encourage in the future.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, a great example. In fact, I was going to ask Professor Thériault specifically about the loofah farms, and loofah farms was actually founded by a McGill graduate. And you see, their greenhouses up on the roofs of different buildings and whatnot, for those not familiar with that. So I'm wondering, Professor Thériault, as someone who sort of studies the economy of agriculture and food, are you hopeful at all that in urban farming, even at a bigger level, we're seeing how can have an impact in terms of the amount and volume of food that we're putting on the market here, and obviously the variety as well?
Urban agriculture is part of the solution. Of course, models like we have in Montreal with loofah farms are great, but whenever you grow crops in greenhouses, you always reach that limit of profitability per square meter at some point. So usually in greenhouses, you will produce high-valued crops or fast-growing crops. For example, cucumbers, tomatoes, they grow vertically. So you can actually get more per square meter. And for the same reason, we would never grow apples in greenhouses because it takes forever for trees to actually start producing. So for some crops, it works, but it would not necessarily work for all crops. And it's all part of changing our consumption habits, I think, that could make it work, like eat in-season food. Let's keep in mind that Canada, during our growing season in summer, we do export to the US because we can produce enough, and we do produce enough, Quebec, Ontario, British Columbia, to export fruit and vegetable to the US. So there's a trade-off where we provide them when it's too hot for them, they provide when it's too cold for us.
All right, interesting. So, Professor Nasiry, I want to ask you this question, and I was a little nervous because it might get a little political, but I see based on our conversation, you're not afraid to say what's on your mind. So, so one thing I've noticed, we've seen the price of groceries skyrocket, and I think we can all agree on that. We've also seen profits at many of our largest grocery store chains rise just as sharply. And I'm wondering, what should we make of this phenomenon? And is this an area maybe where governments might feel obligated to step in and try to regulate what some might refer to as price gouging?
Well, that's definitely a hot button issue, and consumers in Canada are definitely very, very sensitive, and I would even say angry at retailers for what they see as extreme inflation and maybe, as you said, price gouging. That may be happening. So the evidence, however, for this practice is not convincing. So a study that came out of Dalhousie University recently shows that profit margins have been more or less consistent in the past few years with food retailers in Canada. So this is part of the picture, I believe. It simply shows that retailers have not been trying to take on the situation, but it is still does not exonerate them from the situation that we have here in Canada. And there are two reasons for that. One of them is that they don't really have a good reputation with consumers in Canada. So I came in Canada in 2019, but the bread price fixing scandal is a textbook example that I provide in my classes. So for more than a decade in Canada, these major retailers were essentially fixing the price amongst themselves for bakery products, including bread. And of course, that's not the only one. More recently, we had the hero pay scandal as well, where apparently all it took was one email from the CEO of one company to the others to eliminate that planned increase in employees' wages. So and they haven't really invested in building back trust with Canadian consumers. And I believe the main reason for that is that similar to many other industries in Canada, which are either a monopoly or oligopoly, we also have the same situation with the retailing. So we have a few very dominant players in Canada, and because they know consumers do not have any other alternative, then they don't really feel to justify their practices to their consumers. So that's basically one point. And the second point is that, to my understanding at least, in Canada, consumer support groups are either non-existent, or if they are very ineffective, which essentially leaves only the government to come to the support of consumers. But as we all know, governments are usually reactive than proactive. So, for example, we are only expecting to see a report by the Canadian government on recent practices by the retailers only in June 2023. While we have had this inflation, a lot of families struggling with putting food on the table. We are only expecting the government to take some actions, and we will get the report in June 2023, which is to many very, very late. And I believe this is essentially what makes customers feel that they are left alone to deal with the consequences of all these different issues that we just talked about.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for being so forthright in that answer. Professor Thériault, I'm wondering what your take is on that. I mean, you've obviously studied the food industry quite closely. Is Professor Nasiry onto something? I mean, is there blame to lay at the feet of the big grocery chain retailers?
Well, it did bring a smile when he talked about the fact we're in an oligopoly, because usually in that market structure, there's always some interdependence going on. Nobody wants to be the one selling at the highest price, but then nobody has an incentive to undercut themselves, where we can remain that small group that makes a nice, comfortable profit. Second point I'd like to bring to that is that we've seen the profits of the grocery chains reported in dollars. And that's always a risk. And Javad pointed it out. If I, for example, base my business model on a margin, so I say whatever I buy plus 1.5% is whatever I sell. Well, if what I'm buying initially cost more, of course, I'll make more money in the end because I'm just multiplying by 1.5%. So, and I think that's what we're seeing. On a percentage basis, the margin of grocery stores is not going up, but the absolute dollar value is going up. So it does look bad for them, but they're also publicly traded companies. So all the investors want more money out of it. We're kind of stuck in that model.
Interesting. So I guess the one thing, if I listen to you, I guess the advice you have, the one thing we should be buying is stock in these companies.
Well, we're still eating.
That's true. Anyways, I want to revisit a little bit of this, but just again, a reminder, if you're watching live, and we're starting to get a few questions that are coming in, which we'll get to in a minute. The email address again is aoc@mcgill.ca. Professor Nasiry, before we get to sort of some of the questions coming in, I would like to turn away from food for a moment and talk about a very specific area of your expertise and your research, which is the apparel market. I know in your work, you've talked quite a bit about and raised a red flag about a new phenomenon called fast fashion, which I think ties in very nicely to some of the issues we're talking around global supply chain and waste and pricing. Can you explain to us a little bit about what is fast fashion and why we should be so concerned about it?
So fast fashion supply chains are designed around two very important principles. So the business model of fast fashion is designed around one is the variety, and the second is quick response. And I can explain in very simple terms. So variety is that when you step into, let's say, a Zara store, every time you are expecting to see a new collection. As a matter of fact, they're introducing 16 to 24 new collections every year. The same number with H&M is around 12 to 16 collections, which means every time that you go there, you see a new collection. And the second issue is quick response, which means in order to be able to offer this amount of variety, they have built in quick response capabilities. So as soon as they see a change in the market, in consumer taste, they can react to it quickly. Now, this is all fine. This is not really a red flag, but the point is when we combine the two, it means we are building a very expensive supply chain. Now, if this supply chain is expensive to maintain, something has to give. If they keep the prices reasonable, which is what we are seeing with fast fashion companies, H&M, Zara, Boohoo, or Fashion Nova are not really perceived to be high brands, or let's say expensive products. So what happens is that they tend to sacrifice on the quality of the products that they are making. So fast fashion products are known to be something that you wear for a couple of times and then you have to throw away. Or you have the incentives to throw away because they don't really cost much when you buy them and you always want to look fashionable. So you just discard one product and then buy a new wardrobe for yourself. So this essentially translates into a huge amount of waste that these supply chains are producing. And this amount is only increasing simply because the business model is catching up. The business model is not new. It's been there since 1980s. But starting in early 2000, we are seeing many more companies jumping into the idea and trying to compete with major fast fashion retailers. And this is only increasing the amount of waste that we have in apparel. And unfortunately, because the quality of the apparel that is discarded is not that high to start with, there is no secondary usage for these products, which means they have to be either incinerated or they have to go to landfills, adding to the problems that we have in waste management.
Very, very interesting. I'm wondering, when you examine sort of this explosion, this phenomenon of fast fashion, are there lessons to take away from this that might apply to other consumer goods industries as well? Are we going to start to see fast TVs, fast appliances, computers, and whatnot?
So I think I'm going to pick up on one term that Pascal used, and that's essentially consumption patterns. So what it is that we consume and how do we consume. So the point is the reason these supply chains have been successful is that there is strong demand for what they have to offer. They offer a variety of products at relatively low prices. They call the business model democratizing fashion, which means essentially we have to offer the product at low prices so we can sell to more customers. But customers need to be aware of the consequences of these practices. So they have to see what happens to the environment, basically once they buy and use the product and discard them after a couple of uses, and also up the supply chain, upstream the supply chain in the amount of water, in the amount of land, in the amount of different sort of pesticides that are being used in order to grow the crops and then the fabric that comes into the production of these products. And I believe the same thing can be also applied to food supply chains in the sense that customers have to be aware of their consumption patterns. So Pascal mentioned, for example, well, we need to tend to more in-season foods rather than basically things that we cannot have in season. And the second one would be to be more conscious about the waste that we are producing and hopefully try and improve our consumption habits in order to bring down that waste.
Interesting. So, like I said, we've got a bunch of questions that have come in ahead of time or while we're talking about. But maybe before we turn to that, maybe one more question for you, Professor Thériault, if you don't mind. I'm just curious about, maybe what impact, coming out of COVID or having experienced COVID and the pandemic might have had. So, those of you watching today who have really good memories might remember that Professor Thériault was on one of our very first webcasts at the outset of COVID. I think in May or June of 2020, we were still all trying to flatten the curve back then. And we talked a lot about how COVID has changed people's eating habits. Obviously, restaurants were closed. They couldn't go out more. They couldn't travel. And people sort of fell in love with things like eating at home and baking bread and all those sorts of stuff. I'm wondering, is that still with us? And is that perhaps a reason why food prices are so high, because people have just fallen in love with food during the pandemic and are continuing to buy more of it?
Actually, that habit that was developed during the pandemic is one of the solutions that's possible for us right now as we face rising food prices. We've talked, both Javad and I, about how everything is linked and all those percentages of cost keeps adding up. So the one way to save is actually to cost on that chain. So instead of buying ready-to-eat meals, if I decide to buy the ingredients and cook it myself, I will save money right there. And over time, our basket was so cheap that we just got that habit of not taking the time and paying that extra dollar, that 25% more for ready-to-eat food from the grocery store, so we would not have to bother about it. So I think we need to relearn to take the time to cook our own food, as we had plenty of time to do during the pandemic, and that will help our own personal budgets.
So if COVID and lockdowns brought us, home baking and bread making, do you think, grocery store inflation might turn us all into backyard gardeners?
Oh, I'm a big fan of backyard gardening, for one thing, to make us realize how complicated it is to grow tomatoes and not have squirrels eat them if you live in Montreal. But it brings us back to learning to cook with what we have and adapt. Really, I think when you have to cook your own food, you have to adapt. You don't always have all the ingredients available at all time. And that's a challenge for us that's used to that diversity, that cheap food that we've had for so many years.
Great. Interesting. So let's turn our attention to some of the questions that have come in. Again, if you're watching live and want to send in a question, you can email us at aoc@mcgill.ca. So as you might expect, several people have asked if you can share personal strategies for dealing with inflation and the high cost of food. So for instance, we got one email yesterday from Diana Ross, class of 1960, and what a cool name for McGill graduate from the 60s. So she's asking, what, if anything, can we do about these price increases? Do you have any coping suggestions? I don't know, Professor Thériault, if there's any, other than, I guess, cooking things ourselves, any ideas for shoppers to try to save a few dollars?
Well, there's always those collective cooking ideas. So find friends, buy in bulk, and prepare some more food in advance. But that's not always possible. So going back to ingredients and cooking yourself is one way. Looking at sales, but even then, sales are not what they used to be at the grocery store. And quite often when we see sales, we have that phenomenon that's called shrinkflation, where they just, in order to limit the increase in price, decrease the size of containers. So we're actually still paying more. We just don't feel it as much.
Sounds interesting. So, and Professor Nasiry, you want to jump in?
Maybe I can add one that I do personally, given my background in operations. So mine is essentially budgeting. So there are essentially costs that you cannot run away from. So for example, rent or utilities or the basic transportation costs, there is no escape from these costs. So one has to consider those first, and then essentially from the remaining paycheck, one has to consider how much needs to go to food and essentially stick to that budget. And that is definitely going to mean some what we call substitution in the basket, in the sense that, for example, certain products that we don't necessarily need will have to be sacrificed first. So let's say ice cream or chocolate and items that are not necessarily important for our consumption patterns or habits. They will have to essentially wait for maybe a bit for future when we have more reasonable prices. And I believe this budgeting could be a little bit helpful in trying to keep the costs in check. So that would mean perhaps eating a bit less outside because the budget will not allow, you cannot go beyond the budget. And as Pascal mentioned, you can try and maybe cook a bit more in-house in order to bring down or keep the costs within the budget.
I think I agree with everything you said, except for ice cream and chocolate not being necessary. But I'll leave it at that. So let me turn back to you, Professor Thériault. So another email that we received is from Helena Flack. It was more sort of a kind of a consumer rant than a question, but there's some interesting points that she mentions in here, and she talks specifically about going to the grocery store and seeing the price of items, and particularly apples. She says even in the fall when apples are plentiful, they don't really go down in price. And she's asking, are we paying what the actual product costs to produce, or as she puts in her email, are we paying what the market will bear? Any comments, Professor Thériault, on that?
That's a very interesting question because I've commented many times on the current food supply, but I'm also a consumer before and everything else. There indeed some substitution effect that will drive the price up to a point where consumers will stop buying it. There's that increase in cost. There's all those weather patterns that we already talked about, and the fact that our market are interconnected. So if we were supposed to get a given quantity of apples at a given time, that's what we have available right now. So prices are often negotiated months in advance. So it's hard on a spot moment to identify what's caused by market situation, what's caused by what consumers can bear to pay.
Okay, so obviously very complex. Okay, so let me see what else. We just got a question came in from Ross Corcoran. Maybe I'll turn this one to you, Professor Nasiry. It's a bit more, I guess, broad. So he's asking, can we classify the current inflation as more supply-driven versus demand-driven? Meaning, is our best opportunity to reduce inflation to augment supply? I guess what he's suggesting is, can we not just make more stuff so it will cost less?
Mm-hmm. So the point is, during the pandemic, we did have a problem with the prices because of demand. So the demand was strong, and of course, government handouts were also encouraging more consumption. The supply chains were not affected at the beginning of the pandemic, but right now, I believe it's the supply chains that are struggling to keep up. In the sense that the ingredients are more costly, and suppliers have to essentially increase the prices of their products in order to maintain the profit margins. So to me, the current inflation is mainly driven on the supply side rather than on the demand side after the pandemic has eased.
All right. So here's a question from Matthew Gouin about interest rates. So he's writing that understanding that prime rates, interest rates, are used to combat inflation by removing a portion of disposable income that consumers can use to purchase goods. Can you explain how much of an impact does interest rate increases affect the overall consumer price index? Take that one, Professor Nasiry. It's a tricky one.
I'm sorry. I wasn't. Yeah. So to me, this is going to have the impact also over time, because increasing the interest rate, without a doubt, has the impact on cooling the demand, and hopefully this will ease the pressure on the supply chains that are also struggling on their own. So we have seen the impact of increase in the interest rates already on the housing market, and we will see the impacts also in other parts of the economy as we go forward, including in retail markets.
Hey, Professor Thériault, maybe I'll turn this next one to you. It comes to us from Martin McCabe, who thanks us for having this conversation. So he says that central banks seem to be aiming for 2% as a long-term target for inflation. He's wondering if maybe we need to rethink this number and accept a higher number, perhaps 4%. In other words, are we dealing with a structurally higher long-term price inflation for different products, especially if we have to deal with higher oil prices for longer? So is 2% just maybe not reasonable anymore?
It's a possibility. I always like to say that if I could predict the future, I would not be sitting here at McGill teaching. But the challenge, as Javad mentioned, is long term. Whenever you raise interest rates, you create a situation where businesses have to use part of their profit to finance the interest on their loans. And therefore, that slows down reinvestment, that slows down innovation. So it is very in the long term that we end up paying for higher interest rates in the current model. And maybe we are getting punished for a situation we created and nurtured ourselves right now.
Okay. Professor Nasiry, I'll turn this next one to you. This one question from John Graddick, another professor here at McGill and also a past guest on our webcast. So he says, nice discussion about food and fast fashion supply chains, but he's wondering if you could speak a little bit about sustainable practices such as circular economies, and what are the initiatives that are needed to be more focused on the E in ESG?
That's a very good question, and there are many initiatives that can be taken in order to manage, especially apparel supply chains, and make the supply chains, as you called, circular. So a few areas, for example, would be either in the production and consumption stage, or what we call the post-consumption stage. So when it comes to the production and consumption, as I mentioned, educating the consumers in trying to understand the consequences of their habits would be very important. So because the demand exists for the variety that these retailers offer, then it would be very difficult to try and slow down fast fashion and take into account the environmental consequences of their practices. But in case customers are educated and are willing to sacrifice on their consumption habits in order to protect the environment, we will see the benefits down the road. And of course, you can see a proliferation of apparel retailers that are positioning themselves in the market based on their sustainable practices. And these retailers are growing day by day. So that's essentially one stage. And the second stage is the post-consumption stage, where we have a lot of waste produced in apparel that cannot be either reused or recycled. So I believe in Canada, every year we have around 1.3 million tons of apparel waste. And out of that amount, we only recycle or reuse about 250,000 tons. That means more than 1 million tons goes into the landfills and also the incinerators. So investing in post-consumption supply chains in the sense of creating business models to reuse and recycle apparel will be critical. And so this is essentially one. And the second one would be the regulatory oversight. So apparel supply chains these days are subject to a lot of scrutiny by the governments all over the place, in Europe, in North America, and other places. And we are expecting to see more and more regulation, putting pressure on the retailers in order to take into account the externalities they're creating in the form of a waste. So, and I believe in the next 10 years, we will see a major shift in how apparel supply chains are operating in order to take into account the waste that they produce.
Interesting. So, Professor Thériault, I'm wondering, maybe you can comment on the food side of things. You know, when we're talking about food, usually it's perishable items. I mean, how much of the food that we produce actually ends up going to waste? And what are some of the alternatives? Is there ways to get this food to people who need it, or does it end up mostly in landfill and whatnot?
Well, we did talk about food waste briefly early on, and depending what food items you're looking at, and it's always kilos on kilos, so you have some unavoidable waste. Sometimes you talk about 50%. And you mentioned early on, are we paying the real cost of food? That's a growing concern, a growing issue. When you get bananas here for 80 cents a pound, that's after the grocery store took their margin, assuming it's not a loss leader. That's after the distributor was there, it was transported, and then it was grown. So there are externalities we're not paying for when we import food. If I take the opposite parallel, and not everyone's a fan of supply management, but you look at milk price, egg price, and chicken price in Canada, because we're under supply management, producers get paid to cover their cost of production and pay their own salary to a point. So we limit the number of externalities because of that system. Of course, it's a closed system where we don't have necessarily much import exports in it, which is not necessarily what Canadian agriculture is about. But at least in those cases, we limit those externalities, whether it's unpaid labor or poorly paid labor or pollution that we leave in the countries we import from.
The cost for everything, of course. Okay, great. So I think we've just gone through all the questions that have come in. That's wonderful. Thank you, all of you, for taking the time to send those questions in. Before we wrap up, we have a few minutes left, and I don't want to close too early and be accused of shrinkflation. But maybe we can end. I can ask each of you, in terms of sort of the short or medium term horizon, is there any, I guess, sense of optimism in terms of, pricing, inflation coming under control? I think even today, the Canadian Central Bank or the bank announced that inflation seems to be slowing down a little bit. So I guess I'll start with you, Professor Thériault. I mean, how much longer do you think we're going to be dealing with these high prices and sort of, limited supply of food products? Is this a long-term game for us now?
I see it as a long-term game. I mean, we see prices stabilizing right now. We still have not solved the labor issue, because right now we see a rise in wages that will itself create some inflation in the months to come. And oil prices are still high, and it's a very fragile environment right now where if the central banks cut us too much loose, we're going to start spending again. The supply chain won't be able to keep up, and we're going to start spiraling up in inflation yet again, which is what we're trying to avoid without making it so harsh that we stop spending. We have to remember that over 2/3 of our GDP is based off consumption expenditures. We have to keep spending so that people keep their jobs.
And Professor Nasiry, any optimism on your end, or I mean, should I be aspiring now for the Roaring 30s?
Absolutely. So I believe the key word in the situation that we are in at the moment is uncertainty. So it's not really clear what will happen with the geopolitical picture in terms of decoupling of supply chains. So it's very difficult to see what will happen 5 years down the road in relations between East and West on how they want to safeguard their supply chains. It's very difficult to say that. And also, let's say the war in Ukraine, and because Ukraine and Russia are both major exporters of grain and agricultural products. And this means as long as we have this war, the issue is not going to be relaxed. So yes, we had the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which essentially led Ukraine to export the grain. But let's not forget that the land and the labor that is supposed to be working on that land is at the moment caught up with war. And essentially, we're going to be seeing the consequences of these. Even if the war stops tomorrow, we will see the consequences coming down the road until the situation stabilizes. So in the short term, it's difficult to see. As you know, for the next year, for the year 2023, we are expecting almost a 5 to 7% increase in food prices. That is going to translate into a major increase in expenditure for households. But in the long run, I'm hoping. My hope is that once the war is over in that region, and these lingering effects of COVID are also taken care of, especially that now China is open, then we will be seeing a bit more cooling down of the prices all over the economy starting in 2024. But in the long term, it's difficult to see, especially with the key challenge of decoupling of supply chains between East and West.
All right. Sounds like I better get started on a cucumber garden in my backyard.
That would be a good idea.
All right. Well, listen, thank you both so much for this. Just about wraps up the time we do have today. Before we bring the webcast to a close, I would like to remind everyone that this video will be available at this very same link soon after our recording ends. So feel free to share it with others who may not have been able to tune in live. And special bonus, it's free, doesn't cost anything. I would, of course, like to extend my deep gratitude to our two guests, Professors Pascal Thériault and Javad Nasiry, for taking the time to join me today and providing all of us with a deeper understanding of the forces behind rising prices and uneven supplies. Please continue to stay tuned to your McGill email and social media feeds over the coming weeks as we continue to share news about our exciting online and in-person programming. And don't forget, we are now just 3 weeks away from the next edition of McGill 24, our annual 24-hour fundraising event in support of the university's students, professors, and researchers. It might seem counterintuitive to promote a fundraising cause at the tail end of such a sobering discussion on the economy, but the needs are indeed great at McGill. So if you are able to dig just a little deeper this year, the entire McGill community will be deeply appreciative. So please be generous on McGill 24, which takes place this year on Wednesday, March 15th. Until then, please be well and stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.